Imagine a man so consumed by guilt, he's trapped in a nightmare he can't escape. But what if the worst punishment wasn't what we expect? What if the real horror is the silence that follows? In this chilling true crime story, we uncover a twisted tale of remorse, murder, and the darkness that lingers long after the crime is committed. Stay with us till the end. You won't believe how this story unfolds. The room was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, making your heartbeat seem louder. A dim, yellow light flickered from the overhead bulb, casting strange shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed for days. Mark sat in the old armchair, his face blank, hands resting on his knees. His knuckles were pale, the grip from earlier still lingering in the tension of his fingers. The carpet beneath his feet was darkened in patches, the fibers stiff with something that once flowed warm. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second dragging longer than the last. It was broken, stuck at 11:57, but the sound continued, a cruel imitation of time passing. A photo frame lay shattered on the floor. The glass splintered into tiny shards, glittering like deadly stars in the faint light. In the picture, a smiling woman cradled a little girl with curls as bright as sunshine. They looked frozen in a happiness that now felt obscene. Mark's eyes were empty. No trace of tears. No flicker of regret. The knife rested on the table beside him, clean now, its surface gleaming like silver. The rag he used lay crumpled nearby, still damp with the memory of his actions. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling them like a ghost demanding entry. The sound was chilling, a mournful wail that seemed to seep into the room. Mark leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He could still hear the echoes. Not the wind. The screams. High-pitched, desperate, filled with confusion. They started small like a cry for attention, then grew. They grew until they cut through the air, piercing him in ways his conscience did not. The little girl's room had been warm. Pink walls, stuffed animals scattered across the bed, their button eyes staring at him with silent judgment. The woman had fought, but not hard enough. She clawed at him, nails digging into his skin, but her strength waned quickly. He remembered the way her voice cracked when she begged. Begged for her daughter. Begged for mercy. His grip had been unrelenting. The knife had been steady. Now there was just the ticking, and the faint, metallic tang that still clung to his hands. The wind outside grew louder, a mournful scream that echoed through the empty house. Mark's eyes opened, staring at nothing. The shadows on the walls danced with the rhythm of the flickering bulb. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of her favorite candle. It mixed with the sharper, iron tang that clung to his skin, creating a nauseating blend. He stood slowly, his body heavy, movements mechanical. The floor creaked beneath his feet, each step a betrayal, threatening to scream his secrets to the world. His gaze shifted to the corner of the room. The stuffed bear lay slumped there, its one remaining eye glinting in the dim light. It had been her favorite, always tucked under her arm as she toddled around the house. Now, its fur was matted with a stain that didn't belong. Mark's throat tightened, but not with sorrow. With something else. Something darker. He turned his head sharply, as though trying to escape the image. But the hallway ahead offered no solace. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow space suffocating. Pictures lined the corridor, mocking him with their frozen smiles. A family vacation by the lake. A birthday party with balloons and cake. Her first day of school, the backpack almost as big as she was. His breath quickened as he reached the kitchen. The faucet dripped steadily, the sound sharp and rhythmic.
Drip, drip, drip.
He grabbed a glass from the counter, his hands trembling slightly. The cold water rushed over his fingers as he filled it, but it didn't wash away the faint red streaks beneath his nails. He sipped, the cool liquid sliding down his throat, but it didn't quench the dryness. The silence pressed down again, thicker this time. His ears strained, picking up faint noises that shouldn't have been there. A shuffle. A soft creak from upstairs. Mark froze. His grip tightened on the glass until it shattered, shards cutting into his palm. Blood trickled down his wrist, but he didn't flinch. The noise came again, clearer now. A giggle. High-pitched. Familiar. His chest tightened as his eyes darted to the staircase. The sound was unmistakable. It was hers. Mark's breath hitched, sharp and shallow. The giggle echoed again, soft yet piercing, cutting through the oppressive quiet like a blade. It came from upstairs. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the dripping faucet and the howling wind outside. For a moment, his legs refused to move. The air around him felt dense, heavy like it was pressing him down, rooting him in place. But the giggle came again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. Tiny footsteps, the kind he used to hear running through the halls at dawn. His body jerked forward, unthinking, as though pulled by an unseen force. The glass shards crunched beneath his shoes as he stepped into the hallway, leaving faint, smeared prints of red behind him. The staircase loomed ahead, the shadows pooling at its base like spilled ink. Each step he took felt like a deliberate act, his feet heavy, the creaking wood beneath him screaming louder with every movement. As he reached the top, the air grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing second, his breath now visible in faint puffs. The hallway stretched ahead, darker than he remembered. The faint glow of the flickering bulb downstairs barely reached the top floor, leaving the space cloaked in murky darkness. At the end of the hall was her room. The door stood slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling through the gap. The giggle came again. Closer. Clearer. Mark's fingers curled into fists as he stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The hallway felt longer than it should have, stretching impossibly, each step pulling him further into a void of dread. His hand trembled as he reached for the door. It creaked open wider under his touch, revealing the room beyond. The soft pink walls seemed washed out, the color drained under the pale light of the small lamp on the nightstand. The stuffed animals were still scattered on the bed, but the bed itself was empty. The giggle came again, this time from behind him. Mark spun around, his chest heaving, his eyes wide. The hallway was empty,
Silent.
but then he saw it. A faint, shadowy figure at the base of the stairs.
Small.
Unmoving. Her outline was unmistakable, and she was looking up at him. Mark's heart thundered against his ribs, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. He blinked hard, hoping the shadow would dissolve into the dim light. But it didn't. It stayed there, solid and still, its small frame unmistakable. She was standing at the base of the stairs, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if curious. Mark's lips parted, his breath hitching in his throat. The figure didn't move. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. The air felt colder now, biting against his skin. The figure remained silent, unmoving. Then, slowly, her head straightened, and the tilt was gone. She took a step forward. The sound of her footfall was soft, yet it echoed unnaturally in the silence. Mark's knees felt weak, his body frozen in place. His mind raced, grasping at some explanation, some logic, but nothing made sense. She shouldn't be here. She couldn't be here. He saw her. He swallowed hard, the memory slamming into him like a wave. The way her small body had gone limp in his hands. The sound of her voice, high-pitched and pleading, calling out for him, for her mother. The warmth of her blood soaking into his skin as the life drained from her tiny frame. Mark staggered back, gripping the banister for support. The figure moved again, one deliberate step after another, her small feet making no sound now. Her face was obscured, hidden by the shadows that clung to her like a veil. But her presence was suffocating, filling the space with a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on Mark's chest. As she reached the bottom step, her head tilted again, her movements jerky, unnatural. "Daddy," she said, her voice sweet, familiar, but warped, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Mark felt his legs buckle. The word hit him like a physical blow, slicing through his carefully constructed numbness. He sank to the floor, his hands trembling as they pressed against the wooden planks. She took another step forward, and this time, the light caught her face. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were dark now, hollow, like two endless pits that stared straight into him. Her lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't one he recognized. It was cold, unnatural. And as she stood there, just feet away, her voice came again, soft but chilling. "Why did you do it, Daddies?" Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spiraling as the shadows seemed to creep closer, swallowing everything around him. Mark scrambled back, his palms slipping against the cold, polished wood of the floor. Her question lingered in the air, heavy and unrelenting. It echoed in his mind, louder than the wind that battered the windows or the creaks of the old house. His back hit the wall, stopping his retreat. He was trapped. Emma took another step forward, her small figure now fully bathed in the dim light. Her dress, the same soft yellow she'd worn that morning, was torn and stained. The dark patches spread across the fabric like a map of his guilt. Her hair, once soft and curly, now hung in limp, uneven strands, framing her hollow eyes. Mark's chest heaved, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His vision blurred, but he couldn't look away. The sight of her was a knife twisting in his gut, cutting through the last threads of his sanity. I didn't mean," he stammered, the words falling from his lips in broken pieces. Her head tilted again, her dark eyes locking onto his. "You didn't mean to?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with something sharp, something unnatural. The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping up the walls like living things. The flickering bulb overhead dimmed, its light sputtering as though suffocated by the growing tension. "You hurt Mommy too," Emma said, taking another step closer. Her small hands hung at her sides, but they twitched, her fingers curling and uncurling as if they wanted to reach for something or someone. Mark's throat was dry, the words caught there refusing to come out. His mind raced back to that night, the flashes of memory sharp and vivid. The anger, the shouting, the way his wife had screamed his name, her voice cracking with terror. And then Emma's cries, so desperate, so heart-wrenching. "Stop it," Mark whispered, shaking his head, his hands clutching at his temples. "Please stop." But Emma didn't stop. She stepped closer, her small feet eerily silent now. Her presence grew colder, the air around him biting and heavy, suffocating. "Why, Daddy?" she asked again, her voice cracking, a mixture of innocence and accusation. Mark pressed his back harder against the wall, as if he could disappear into it, escape this nightmare. Tears streamed down his face, his chest heaving with silent sobs. I didn't," he started, but the words caught in his throat. She crouched now, her small frame looming larger in the dim, oppressive light. Her face was inches from his, her hollow eyes boring into his soul. "Didn't what?" she whispered. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, another voice called out. Soft, broken, but unmistakable. "Emma?" It was his wife's voice. Mark's blood ran cold. Emma's smile widened. The shadows around her deepened, twisting and curling as if alive. "She's coming, Daddy," Emma said, her voice a haunting sing-song. Mark's scream caught in his throat, his body trembling as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway below. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing like a countdown. Mark's heart hammered against his chest, a wild, panicked rhythm. The sound wasn't distant anymore. It was climbing the stairs. Every creak of the wood sent a fresh jolt of terror through his body. Emma didn't move. She stayed crouched before him, her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Her smile grew wider, stretching unnaturally across her pale face. "You can't run," she whispered, her voice low, almost playful. Mark shook his head violently, his hands gripping his knees as if to anchor himself. The air around him was suffocating now, thick with an unseen weight. The footsteps reached the landing, stopping just outside the hallway. Mark's eyes darted to the staircase, his chest heaving. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and distorted, cast by a figure just out of sight. "Emma," the voice called again, softer this time, but no less haunting. It was unmistakably her, his wife. Mark's hands flew to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. The voice was inside him now, echoing in his skull, each syllable scraping against his mind. "You can't hide, Mark," the voice said, colder now, closer. Emma tilted her head, her hollow eyes glinting with something dark, something knowing. "She remembers," Emma said, her tone laced with cruel delight. Mark's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His eyes darted between Emma and the staircase, his body trembling violently. "No," he choked out, his voice breaking. She can't." But then the figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Her silhouette was unmistakable. The same long hair that had once cascaded down her back. The same slender frame that had stood in the doorway of their daughter's room, tucking her in at night. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. The shadows clung to her, shifting and writhing as if alive. Mark's vision blurred with tears as she stepped closer. Her face came into view, pale and lifeless, her eyes sunken but fixed on him with an unrelenting stare. Her lips parted, and from them came a sound that froze his blood. A laugh. Low, hollow, and echoing with malice. Mark pressed himself harder against the wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. The woman took another step, her hand reaching out, her fingers thin and claw-like. "Why, Mark?" she asked, her voice overlapping Emma's, the two merging into a chilling harmony. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head furiously, his hands clutching his hair. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. But when he opened his eyes, they were both standing over him now. His wife and his daughter, their hollow faces twisted into unnatural grins. And then Emma spoke again, her voice soft, almost tender. "It's your turn now, Daddy." Mark's scream echoed through the house, but it was swallowed by the darkness as the shadows closed in. The darkness wrapped around Mark like a living thing, cold and suffocating. His scream was cut short, his breath stolen as if the air itself had turned to ice. The room dissolved into shadow, the walls, the floor, the very sense of space folding into an endless void. Mark clawed at the darkness, his hands grasping at nothing. He could feel their presence, Emma's and hers, looming over him, pressing down on him, their cold eyes burning into his soul. "You thought it would end here," his wife's voice whispered, close to his ear, though her face was nowhere in sight. It was a mockery of the softness it once held, now sharp and venomous. Mark stumbled backward, his feet finding no solid ground, as though he were falling endlessly. The cold laughter of his daughter echoed around him, high-pitched and relentless. "Where are you going, Daddies?" Emma's voice called, teasing, her words like needles pricking at his sanity. The darkness shifted. Shapes began to form, blurry and indistinct at first, but they grew sharper as the seconds stretched into eternity. The room reappeared, but it wasn't the same. The walls were warped, the colors muted and stained with crimson streaks. The floor beneath him was no longer wood, but a glossy black surface that seemed to ripple like liquid. In the center of the room stood a single object, a mirror. Tall and ancient, its frame was carved with grotesque faces, their hollow eyes watching him. The glass shimmered, its surface reflecting not the room around it, but something else. Mark approached it slowly, his steps hesitant, his body trembling. The reflection that greeted him was not his own. It was a version of himself, twisted, bloodied, and grinning maniacally. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that stared back with a cruel intensity. "No," Mark whispered, shaking his head, stepping back. But the reflection moved closer, as if stepping out of the glass, its grin widening. "You can't hide from what you are," it said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. Mark's chest tightened, his breathing shallow as the reflection reached out a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass. From behind him, Emma's giggle rang out again, followed by her mother's cold, hollow laugh. "They're waiting for you," the reflection hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Mark turned, but the shadows surged forward, pulling at him, dragging him toward the mirror.
No.
"No, please," he screamed, his nails clawing at the slick floor as the pull grew stronger. The voices surrounded him now, overlapping, a cacophony of cries, laughter, and whispers. And as his body was yanked toward the glass, the last thing he saw was his twisted reflection, grinning wildly as it whispered one final word. "Welcome." The mirror shattered, shards exploding outward, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The shards of the shattered mirror hung suspended in the void, glinting with an unnatural light. Mark's body tumbled into the abyss, weightless, yet he felt as if he were sinking deeper into something thick and suffocating. Each breath he tried to take was labored, the air around him dense and cold. The voices followed him, Emma's, her mother's, and his own twisted echo. They swirled together, overlapping, rising and falling in chaotic harmony. "Daddy," Emma's voice called softly, but it was laced with venom. "Do you see now?" His wife's voice followed, sharp and cold. "This is what you created, Mark." The darkness began to ripple, the void giving way to flashes of memories. Not his memories. At least, not entirely. The images blurred together, disjointed and grotesque. A family dinner, the clink of plates and soft laughter. Then a sudden snap, his voice, raised and angry, cutting through the warmth like a knife. Emma flinched in her seat, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. Her mother reached out to her, but Mark's shadow loomed over both of them. The memory shifted violently. The bedroom.
Shouts. Tears.
His wife's voice trembling with fear, pleading. Emma crying, her small frame pressed against the wall, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. "Stop it, Mark. You're scaring her." His own voice came next, unrecognizable in its rage, distorted and monstrous. "Do you think I care?" The images faded, replaced by silence. Mark floated there, his body limp, his mind reeling from the onslaught. "No," he murmured, his voice barely audible. This wasn't me. I didn't." But the void didn't care. The darkness began to reshape itself, twisting into a new form. He was standing now, the floor beneath him solid but wrong, cold and slick, like polished stone coated in frost. The air smelled of decay, a sickly sweet stench that made his stomach churn. Ahead of him stood a doorway, its frame jagged and uneven, the space beyond it pulsating with a sickly red light. He knew he didn't want to step through it. But his legs moved on their own, his body drawn forward, as if by invisible strings. The light grew brighter as he approached, casting long, warped shadows that twisted unnaturally with each step. When he crossed the threshold, the room beyond was suffused with red. The walls dripped with something dark and viscous, the ground beneath him sticky with the same substance. In the center of the room stood a table, and on that table, lying perfectly still, were two bodies. His wife.
His daughter.
Their lifeless eyes stared up at him, unblinking, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Mark's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his hands trembling as he reached out instinctively. "No," he choked, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face, but they offered no release, no relief. The shadows in the room began to move, coiling and writhing like living things. They whispered his name, over and over, growing louder until the sound was deafening. Mark clutched his head, screaming into the suffocating air. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The voices stopped. And then, Emma's voice spoke again, soft, clear, and chilling. "It's too late for sorry, Daddy." The shadows surged forward, engulfing him in an instant, and the red light faded to black. Mark's world was now an endless void, a crushing silence replacing the cacophony of voices. He floated, weightless and alone, the cold seeping into his very being. For a moment he thought it was over. The torment, the guilt, the unbearable weight of their voices. But the silence was worse. It pressed against his chest, suffocating, as if the void itself had a heartbeat, slow and heavy. Then, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was dim, barely more than a pinprick, but it pulsated, growing with each thud of the unseen heartbeat. Mark's body moved toward it, though he didn't will it. The light grew brighter, the void around him twisting and pulling away like a curtain being drawn back. And suddenly he was standing in the living room of their house. Everything looked as it had before. The soft yellow walls. The couch where Emma used to curl up with her bear. The family photos lining the shelves. For a fleeting moment, he thought he had woken from the nightmare. But the air was wrong.
Too still.
Too quiet. He turned, and there they were, sitting on the couch, side by side, staring at him. His wife's hands rested on her lap, her fingers pale and stiff. Emma clutched her bear, the once soft for now matted and dark. Their eyes fixed on him, unblinking, hollow. "Sit," his wife said, her voice cold and flat. Mark's legs moved without his consent, carrying him to the armchair opposite them. He sank into it, his body heavy, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence stretched unbearable until Emma tilted her head, her small lips curling into that same unnatural smile. "Do you remember, Daddy?" she asked, her voice sweet but wrong. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't mean," he began, his voice trembling. His wife leaned forward, her lifeless gaze piercing through him. "You didn't mean to what, Mark?" Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment, it was filled with raw emotion, grief, rage, and something darker. Mark shook his head, his body trembling. I was angry. I didn't." "You did," Emma interrupted, her small voice sharp as a blade. "You hurt us." Her bear slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Mark's eyes darted to it, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The walls of the room began to darken, the yellow paint peeling away to reveal something black and pulsating beneath. The family photos melted, the faces twisting and distorting until they were unrecognizable. "You made your choice," his wife said, her voice low and steady. Mark's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please forgive me." But their faces didn't soften. Their expressions remained cold, unyielding. Emma stood, her small frame unnaturally rigid as she took a step toward him. Her mother followed, rising in the same jerky, unnatural way. "You don't get to leave," Emma said, her hollow eyes gleaming. "Not until you feel what we felt." The walls closed in, the darkness swallowing the room. And then, with a sudden, violent pull, Mark was dragged into the abyss, once more, their hollow faces the last thing he saw before the void claimed him. The darkness swallowed him whole, deeper and colder than before. His body twisted and writhed, suspended in nothingness, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing force. He wanted to scream, but no sound came, only a suffocating silence that drowned out all reason. Images flashed in his mind, memories of their lives, of his wife's smile, of Emma's laugh, all tainted now by the stain of his own hands. "Please," he whispered to the empty void. His words dissolved into the air, as if the void itself refused to acknowledge his plea. The emptiness stretched on forever, unrelenting, swallowing every shred of light and hope. But then, slowly, something shifted. A glimmer of light pierced through the blackness, faint at first, but steadily growing. Mark's eyes shot open, though he wasn't sure he was even truly awake. It was the same glow, the sickly red light from before. And once again, he found himself standing, this time in a familiar place. The living room. But it was different. The walls were cracked, the furniture shattered, the air thick with dust and decay. The scent of blood was unmistakable, mingling with something worse, something rancid, like the remnants of long-forgotten rot. And there they were again, his wife and daughter, seated in the same spots on the couch, their eyes locked onto him, unblinking, empty. He froze. He could feel their gaze like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. "Do you understand now?" His wife's voice came, low and hollow. She didn't move, but her words lingered in the room, echoing in the broken silence. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the pain he had caused. I didn't mean it," he stammered, his voice raw and broken. But the words felt hollow in his mouth. They felt like a lie. "Then why, Mark?" Emma's voice asked, her tone still sweet, but sharp as a blade. The little girl stood, her movements stiff and jerky, her bear clutched tightly in her arms. Mark couldn't tear his eyes away. Her smile, the one that haunted his every thought, was stretched wide across her face, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "Why did you do it?" she asked again, the question ringing in the air, heavier now, impossible to ignore. Mark felt his knees buckle. He couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words. The light from the walls flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It wasn't just the room that was decaying. It was the very essence of everything around him. The air felt thick with malice, and for the first time, Mark felt the weight of his own guilt, raw and unrelenting. Suddenly, the darkness surged forward, swallowing the room in an instant. The light, the faces, the air, they were all consumed by the same force that had been chasing him from the moment he had taken that first step into the abyss. "Mark," his wife's voice echoed through the shadows, distant and fading, but still carrying the same weight. "Mark, you can never escape." And with those final words, the darkness closed in, and Mark was lost to it. The darkness around him began to thin, as if reality itself was starting to unravel, thread by thread. Mark floated, his limbs numb, his mind struggling to grasp the fading images that danced at the edges of his consciousness. Was this it? Was this the end? The oppressive weight lifted ever so slightly, but the void remained, silent, suffocating, unyielding. Then, just as his mind was on the verge of collapse, a light appeared. Not the sickly red light from before, but a soft, pale glow, faint but promising. It flickered once, then twice, like the fragile flame of a candle struggling to survive against the wind. Mark's eyes snapped open, his heart racing, though he no longer understood what he was feeling. Hope? Fear? Desperation? The light grew brighter, clearer, revealing a distant figure standing just beyond its reach. It was Emma. Her form was shrouded in shadow, her figure impossibly small, but it was unmistakably her. She looked at him with those hollow, dark eyes, but this time there was no malice, only a strange, aching sorrow. Her voice, so soft it almost didn't seem to belong to the same world as him, broke the silence. "Daddy, why didn't you stop?" Mark's breath caught in his throat.
I
couldn't," he whispered, his voice trembling. Emma took a step forward, her little feet light, barely making a sound. "I loved you," she said, her voice soft but filled with something beyond words. Mark reached out, but his hands trembled, unable to bridge the distance between them. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he pleaded, his voice breaking. But Emma didn't move closer. She simply watched him, her face softening with an almost imperceptible sadness. "You can't change it now," she whispered. The light around her grew brighter, blinding. And then, in an instant, the darkness shattered, and Mark was left standing alone. The figures, the voices, the shadows, they were gone. But so was the weight of his guilt. For the first time, there was nothing. No sound. No sensation. No memory. Mark was free. But as he stood there, suspended in the eternal void, he realized freedom was just another form of endless isolation. The emptiness around Mark stretched endlessly, like a vast ocean with no shore, no anchor. He stood alone, feeling both weightless and heavy at the same time. His mind was numb, disconnected from everything he had once known. No past, no future, only the present, stretching infinitely before him. But something was different now. The oppressive voices, the haunting presence of Emma and his wife, they were gone. The darkness had faded, and the void had released its grip on him. For a moment, Mark wondered if he was free. Was this peace? Was this what awaited him after everything he had done? He didn't know.
He didn't understand.
All he knew was the silence. The eerie stillness that surrounded him felt less like a curse and more like a strange, unfamiliar relief. He let out a shaky breath, the sound breaking the quiet, yet somehow blending with it. Was this his punishment? To exist in this endless limbo, cut off from all the pain and the guilt, but also from the love that once filled his life. The thought gnawed at him, but there was no one to answer, no one to acknowledge his torment. It was just him, standing at the edge of an infinite unknown. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted again. A faint light flickered on the horizon, far in the distance. At first, it was nothing more than a speck, a glimmer barely visible to the naked eye. But it grew. It expanded, and with it came a warmth, gentle and comforting, as if inviting him to take one more step. Mark's heart, frozen for what felt like eternity, stirred at the sight.
He didn't know what it meant.
He didn't know where it led. But he knew one thing. He was ready to walk toward whatever lay ahead. And as the light wrapped around him, the shadows faded into nothingness, leaving only the quiet hum of a new beginning. Mark took his first step forward, and the silence, at last, seemed to embrace him.